Good morning. I want to welcome everyone here this morning. That's everyone in the auditorium, everyone in the classrooms, everyone streaming in the parking lot, everyone streaming from home, wherever you are, whoever you might be. If you are longtime members or guests, we're glad that you're worshiping with us this morning. There's nothing better that we could be doing with our time than worshiping our God. Before I get started, I want to mention there's a couple of firsts for me this morning. One, I told you about in an email yesterday. I'm not going to be using PowerPoint. I have to admit, I'm a little bit nervous about that. I always use PowerPoint, and I use it to kind of visually tell me what I'm going to say next. So hopefully I won't need that, and I'll remember what I have prepared. The second thing that I wanted to tell you, the second first is I'm not preaching one of my sermons. I'm preaching somebody else's sermon. And that somebody else is Mark Roberts. He's a preacher at Westside Church of Christ in Irving, Texas. And he preached this sermon in 2017. And since then, I have listened to it many, many, many times over the years. It resonates very deeply with me. And I figured, given what's going on in the world today, there's a really good chance it might resonate with you as well. So I'm going to give it my best. And hopefully you will come away feeling as encouraged by it as I have each time I've listened to it. We're going to spend the bulk of our time today looking at Philippians 4, verses 6 through 7 in particular, and surrounding passages. And I want to start out by reading verse number 6 to you. That's Philippians 4, verse 6. It says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving let your requests be made known to God." Now, I don't know about you, but I personally cringe a little bit when I read this verse. I mean, I really do. I have a lot that I struggle with in my life. I've struggled with depression. I've struggled with anxiety. I've had fear about how things are going to turn out, whether or not things are going to get better or get worse. And this is a verse that you always hear or that you always go to in those situations. It says, don't be anxious. Don't be anxious. Done. Problem solved. It makes me cringe a little bit, I have to admit, because it says instead of being anxious, and by the way, the word anxious here does not equate to clinical anxiety, right? Panic attacks and anxiety, that's a different thing entirely. But that fear of not knowing what's going to happen, and is it going to get worse, and am I going to be prepared for what's next? Can I live up to the stress that my life is dealing out to me right now? That's what it's talking about. And it says, when you have that, stop and pray to God. And if you pray to God, the peace of God will guard your heart. And that's the part I cringe about a little bit, because I feel like if I don't have that peace of mind, if I don't have God guarding my heart, then I'm probably doing something wrong, which makes me more anxious. So it's kind of a feedback loop here. And it's hard enough in our everyday lives. We all have things that we're struggling with. We all have sickness. We all have financial problems. There are a number of things that plague us in this life, and 2020 is not making it any easier, is it? 2020 is just not messing around. And I know Nick did a good job talking about some of the things that have happened so far this year. I won't go into great detail, but I do think it's important to mention a few things. So far in 2020, 25.5 million acres of land had burned up in Australia. We've had legitimate fear of going to war with Iran. We've seen Iran shoot down a Ukrainian airliner, killing 176 people. The UK is withdrawing for the European Union. I have several friends who live in London, and I know they have a lot of fear and anxiety about what the future holds for them in regards to that. We've had floods in Indonesia. We had riots in India. We've had volcanic eruptions in the Philippines. There have been swarms of locusts and killer hornets. Of course there are killer hornets. Somebody said, this season of Earth is just not realistic. Why did they introduce the hornet character if it's not important to the story? I don't understand that either. And of course, on top of all of this, we have a global pandemic that so far has killed more people in the United States than died in World War I. That's unbelievable to me. And along with that, of course, is record levels of unemployment, stock market volatility, protests, riots, and the list goes on. 2020 is not messing around, and I don't know about you. When you look at your news feed, I feel scared. It's a bit scary. So what are we supposed to do? Oh, well, don't be anxious for anything. That's what you're supposed to do. That's easy, right? Is that really what Paul meant to say? Is it really that simple? Did Paul just not understand how difficult it would be to live in this world? Did he just not understand how difficult it was going to become in the future? I don't think that that's the case. Let's take a minute to look at Paul's life, to look at the society that he lived in, and I think we'll find out that it was really hard back then too. Paul lived in the Roman Empire, and we know from historians that the poorest in the Roman Empire lived in shabby, squalid homes that were in danger of falling apart or burning down at any minute. And when hard times really hit, a lot of poor families gave up their children to the streets, hoping that someone would come along and take them and make them an indentured servant, which would be better than the life that they would have at home. We know that there were no antibiotics. We know that there was very primitive medicine, and even what medicine they did have, it was not highly available to everyone that lived during those times. Travel, especially, was extremely dangerous, and it was dangerous to be a Christian, and increasingly more and more dangerous to be a Christian as the years went on. So, that's why Paul was sitting in jail, and he took a pen to paper and wrote to the Ephesians and said, man, the first century is not messing around. Do you see what's going on outside? I'm getting pretty scared. No, that's not what he said. What he said was, do not be anxious for anything, but by prayer and supplication make your requests known to God, and the peace of God will guard your heart. How in the world did Paul write that? He must have seen the world differently than I see it, than we see it today. Despite the difficulties of the time that he lived in, he somehow managed to have a peace of mind. And in this morning's lesson, I want us to take a few minutes to examine how he was able to say that, to examine how he was able to have that peace of mind, because I firmly believe that each and every one of us can have that exact same peace of mind. But before we get started, I want to talk to you about what peace of mind is not. I think it's really important to set the stage here because I think there are some misunderstandings of what peace of mind means. Melissa Kruger is an evangelical writer who writes a lot of articles, many of which are about this concept of peace of mind. And she says that it's dangerous when we start thinking about this because words like content and contentment, they conjure up these ideas of reaching some Zen-like, mystical, meditative state. We think about meditating and checking out from this world. We don't live here anymore. The real world doesn't exist. We're living on the beach with our toes in the sand and an iced tea in our hand. We don't have any stress. There's no health. There's no problems, no financial difficulties. It's all good. Everything's fine. Everything's fine at home. Everything's fine at work. My health is fine. I'm doing really well. I've reached this amazing state of being where everything that comes out of my mouth is wise, and I know exactly the right thing to say at exactly the right time. But I can't relate to this. Can you? I don't live on the beach. That's not where I exist. I personally have struggled with clinical depression, clinical anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and the list goes on. I don't live on the beach. But guess what? Paul didn't live on the beach either. His life was not carefree. It was not burden-free. He was not surrounded, I should say, by relationships that never disappointed him, that only ever made sure to lift him up and help him grow spiritually. In fact, I think it's important for us to take a look at Paul's life for a minute, to just get grounded in reality here. I'm going to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 8. This is a verse that I think really highlights what it was like for Paul. It really underlines this idea that he did not live on a beach. 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 8 says, "For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia, for we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of our life itself." Look at that again. Utterly burdened beyond our strength. I can't take this anymore. It says he was despaired of his life itself. That doesn't just mean that he was afraid he was going to die. That means that he didn't want to keep living. He was despaired living life in this world. It would be better for Jesus to come again and for it to all be over. Paul's life most definitely was far from being worry-free or stress-free. He was utterly burdened beyond his strength. And he absolutely had relation problems. We're going to look at 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 10. This is one example of a relationship problem that I think was probably pretty hard for Paul to deal with. In 2 Timothy 4 and verse 10, it says, "For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia." Now this is a simple verse. It's very quick. It's easier for us to gloss over it. But Demas, if we do a little digging, was one of Paul's chief and most trusted lieutenants. Someone that was very important to him. And not only did he reject Paul, but he rejected God. He rejected God for this world. You know that had to hurt Paul. Because Paul's entire life, the core of his being, all of his work was focused on devoting his life to establishing churches across the Roman Empire. And not only does he have his most trusted advisor leaving him because he'd rather go be in the world, he was subverted by false teachers everywhere that he went. Saying Paul, they said that Paul was a nobody. He's not really even an apostle. You shouldn't be listening to him. In verse 10 of 2 Corinthians chapter 10, it says, "For they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is of no account." They rejected him. They rejected his apostleship. They put him down physically. Apparently, he had some physical ailments that he was dealing with. They said that he was not eloquent in speech, something that Paul himself even admitted. They were trying to discredit him at every turn. And this also implies, I think, that Paul labored with some health problems. They talk about him being weak in stature. We read about him having thorns in the flesh. In Galatians 4 and verse 15, it suggests that he had some kind of chronic eye problem. So Paul's life is not, living on the beach. I think it's safe to say that he had a very hard life, a life that inspired him to write 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 2. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 2, it says, "For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling." Paul was a tent maker. This analogy makes sense. He compares our bodies to a tent. He says, in this tent we groan. We don't want to live anymore. Life is hard. Too many bad things are happening. I want to go to that day where Jesus comes back and he gives us a new resurrected heavenly body. One that won't be subject to all the pain that we're experiencing today. One that will allow us to live with God in heaven for all eternity. Paul was regularly persecuted. People threw rocks at him. He was thrown in prison. There's a very long list of things that happened to Paul. And if you want that full list, I would suggest you go read Acts. You go read 2 Corinthians chapter 11. But you know what? Even given all of that, his life wasn't always this way. Right? Paul's life, if we go back far enough, actually looked pretty good. He was highly educated. He was well respected. He was high regarded. He had a really good career ahead of him. He was advancing in his career as a member of the Sanhedrin. He was a pretty big deal in Jerusalem, a Jew among Jews. He had it all until he became a Christian. When he became a Christian, his career was over. He lost his job. He became financially impoverished. People literally started throwing things at him. He was not trusted by the Jews, and he was not trusted by the Christians. Which makes perfect sense, right? Because he persecuted them right up until the point he became a Christian. He was all alone in the world, and no one really liked him or cared for him. And over the course of his ministry, he was bitten by a snake, he was shipwrecked, he was whipped. False teachers tried to tear him down at every single turn and discredit all of the work he dedicated his life to. You could say that Paul's life started out amazing, but got to the point where it couldn't get much worse. So how in the world did he write Philippians 4 verses 6 and 7? How did he say, "Be anxious for nothing, pray to God, and the peace of God will guard your heart"? Later in verse 11 of Philippians 4, he said, "I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content." And remember, contentment does not mean life on the beach, doesn't mean being totally checked out, doesn't mean laying in a hammock, lazily watching the world pass you by. So, are you interested in finding out how Paul got this peace of mind? I know I am. I know when I first heard this sermon, Brother Roberts had me on the edge of my seat. I want to know, how did he do this? And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. I've got 5 principles that I want to share with you that Paul lived his life by that helped him achieve this peace of mind. And these are 5 principles that we can adopt in our lives to help us achieve that peace of mind as well. The first principle that we should live by is we need to end bitterness. Let's look at Ephesians 4 and verse 31. Ephesians 4 and verse 31 really sets the stage for all 5 of these principles. It's where it all begins for Paul. I think it is the foundational thing that he lived his life by. Ephesians 4 and verse 31 says, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice." Do you think Paul had anything to be bitter about? Absolutely he did. He was once on the Sanhedrin Council. This was the highest, most supreme law in all of the Jewish land. And have you ever wondered about how he got fired from the council? You ever wonder where that happened? When did they do it? How did they do it? What did they say to him? What did he say to them? How did it make him feel? We don't know about these things, and we don't know because Paul never talked about them. There's no rants in the Bible. There's no venting. There's no, I've just got to get this off my chest. There's no, I'm going to use that guy as a sermon example and show people how not to act. I'm going to show people how unfairly I was treated. And then they'll understand why I'm so angry. No, there was none of that in the Bible because Paul didn't talk about it. And the reason he didn't talk about it is because he dealt with that kind of pain and mistreatment differently. And we learn about how he dealt with it in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 14. In 2 Timothy 4 and verse 14, we have just a small little example of how Paul deals with the hurt that other people throw his way. In that passage, 2 Timothy 4 and verse 14, it says, "Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds." That's why Paul didn't talk about that day that he got fired from the Sanhedrin. He didn't need to. God was going to take care of it. This is the attitude that Paul had. God's got this. I'm going to let God handle this. I'm going to put away all bitterness from my life and let God take control. And if we want the kind of peace of mind that Paul had in his life, we've got to stop obsessing about what other people have done to us. We've got to stop obsessing about what other people have said to us. We've got to stop mentally rehearsing what we should have said, what we ought to have said, what we're going to say one day when I get them backed into a corner and I can really give them what for. We've got to stop mentally talking about others in our own heads, and we've got to stop talking to others about others. We've got to let it go. If you have a problem with someone and you can make it right, then you make it right. That's what it says in Matthew chapter 5. But if you can't make it right, then you need to let it go. Put bitterness and grudges out of your life and let God take control. And that fits very nicely in with the next principle. The next principle that Paul used to spend his life, and that was stop living in the past. We've got to stop living in the past. And if we look at Paul as to why this was so important to him and how this helped him achieve a peace of mind, it makes sense because he had a very unbelievable past, didn't he? Think about it. He persecuted the church. And yet, there's not too many times that he talks about that in the Bible either. He does. It's rare. It's usually in Timothy. But he does it so that he can talk about the incredible mercy and grace of God. He loves to talk about what God did for him, but he does not live in the past. I don't know about you, but I have a problem living in the past. I tend to dwell on things that happened that I think maybe if it had happened differently, I would have gone down a different path and maybe not had as much suffering as I have in my life. Or I like to dwell on something that I did that I'm very embarrassed about. Or how many times I committed the same sin, which leads me to believe that I don't deserve the grace or the forgiveness of God. And if I feel that way, how much more did Paul feel that way. But instead, we learn about how Paul reacts to this in Philippians 3 and verse 12. We learn from this passage how Paul treats his past. Philippians 3 and verse 12, it says, "Not that I have already obtained this or am already perfect, but I press on to make it my own because Christ Jesus has made me his own." Paul was constantly moving forward. He was constantly focused on the future, and that's what we need to do. If your past is bad, if you think it's worse than the Apostle Paul, which keep in mind, he considered himself the chiefest among sinners, you need to push forward too. You need to move forward and quit looking over your shoulder. You need to quit wallowing in self-pity. You need to quit putting yourself down. You need to quit telling yourself that you don't deserve the forgiveness that God has graciously offered to us. Because all that does is keep you from his mercy and his grace, and it keeps you from servicing him. And it keeps you from the peace of mind that Paul had. Let's listen to Paul in Romans chapter 14 and verse 24. This is going to seem a little out of place, a little like a tangent, but I think there's something important that we can get from this passage. Romans chapter 14 and verse 24, Paul says, "I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain, and to be helped on my journey there by you once I have enjoyed your company for a while." Despite everything going on in Paul's life, he was actively making plans for the future, plans to be effective in God's kingdom. And in this verse, for example, he says, "I'm coming to see you. I hope to see you as I pass by Spain." There's a calmness that comes over him, and I think that can come over us if we let go of the past and instead think about the future in terms of our service to God. We make plans for what we're going to do next, who we're going to talk to next, who we're going to encourage next, who can help us along our way. Instead of looking back at what happened, what didn't happen, what we wished has happened, we need to stop thinking about yesterday. That's what Paul did. He doesn't think about the Christians that he threw in jail. He doesn't think about holding the coats of the men who stoned Stephen to death. He presses on to tomorrow. And in doing that, he's living out this next principle as well, which is do what you can, where you are, with what you have. I think there is no better example in the Bible of someone doing what they can, where they are, with what they have. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. In Acts chapter 13, Paul was preaching in the synagogue. And he immediately goes to the Old Testament and reads passages that prove that Jesus is the Messiah. He ties these scriptures to the work that Jesus did while he was here. He ties them to the teaching that Jesus did while he was here. And he ties it to Jesus' death and resurrection on that cross. A few chapters later, in Acts 17, he finds himself in Athens. And he's speaking to a bunch of pagan philosophers. Does he reach for the Old Testament? Nope. Those philosophers don't know what the Jewish scripture is. They don't care what the Jewish scripture is. They're not going to listen to Jewish scripture. There's no quotations from the Old Testament in this sermon. What does Paul do instead? He quotes pagan poets and pagan philosophers. And then what does he do next? He takes that sermon to the very same place, which is Jesus Christ crucified and resurrected on the next day. He adapted to the situation by doing what he could, where he was, with what he had. Throw Paul in jail and he's going to sing hymns until midnight. Try to assassinate him, he's going to appeal to Caesar and get a change of venue, and you're never going to get a shot at him. I think the best illustration of this comes from Acts chapter 21. Towards the end of the chapter, Paul's being thrown in jail again, and as they drag him up the steps of the fortress, the crowd below starts to riot because they want him dead. So Paul says to the centurion in verse 39, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." Now, most of us, I think, being dragged up the stairs as the crowd is pressing forward, asking for our death, would probably be like, "Get me out of here." But Paul says, you know what? I've got some credentials. I think you ought to let me speak to these people. And so the centurion gave him permission. He raised his hand, and a hush fell over the crowd, and he spoke to them in Hebrew, saying, "Brothers and fathers, hear this defense." And guess what the next words out of his mouth were? He was talking about Jesus. He did what he could, where he was, with what he had. You never heard Paul saying, if only, or I wish, or I probably should have done this, or I wish I would have done that, or I couldn't do what I wanted to do because of what this person did to me, or that person said to me, or because I was in jail. He never made those excuses. He put the power of this principle to work. He did what he could, where he was, with what he had. And the interesting thing about these first three principles, ending bitterness, stop living in the past, do what you can where you are with what you have, they all force us to live in the now. And living in the now, thinking about what's happening right now and how can I serve God right now, that's the most important thing that we need to be doing. And that leads to the next principle, because what Paul often did in the here and now was build relationships. I've talked about it before in a number of different sermons. We are built for relationships. God created us to have a relationship with him. He gave us bodies that are naturally inclined to want to be with one another. And I think right now we probably all understand that better than maybe we have before, being in quarantine for so long. I remember the first time we had our Zoom meeting on Wednesday night, how great it was to see each other. And we joked that all we were doing is sitting around looking at each other. When we first came back to in-person services here, it was wonderful to see each other, and it was very difficult not to shake hands or give hugs. We are built for relationships. And in Romans 16, we see that relationships were a big part of Paul's peace of mind too. He surrounded himself by people who loved him and cared for him, even if by epistle only. His letters were filled with notes about people who were important to him. People like Priscilla and Aquila and Timothy and Titus and Philemon and Epaphroditus, and the list goes on. We don't always know a lot about these people, but one thing we do know is they were very important to Paul. Did some of them disappoint him? Yeah, you better believe they did. We've already read about Demas, and you can't read that passage about Demas without feeling the crushing disappointment that stabbed Paul deeply when someone he loved so dearly left him and left the gospel for the world. But he never let the hurt that comes from someone you trust betraying you like that. He never let that hurt lead him to withdraw from people, to build up a barrier around himself. Instead, he kept pressing forward, making connections with people. He was not afraid to tell them how much he loved them. He was not afraid to ask them for help. In 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 9, we see some examples of this. In 2 Timothy 4 and verse 9, he says, "Do your best to come see me." And in verse 11, he says, "Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for my ministry." And he even adds at the end of the epistle, "Do your best to come before winter. I need you. I'm counting on you. Please come help me." And if you think about it, it's amazing that Paul did all of this with ink and papyrus. And I don't even know how the postal service worked then. I don't even know how long it took to get a letter from one place to another. It was probably people on foot sent as messengers. Can you imagine what Paul would do if he lived now? If he had all the electronic tools that we have today? Can you imagine how often he'd be texting or messaging or tweeting or liking or doing whatever it is that you do on the internet to say to people, "I value you, I love you, I like what you're doing, your work is important, keep up the good work, I need your help, can I spend some time with you, can we have lunch?" Paul would be all over that, which makes me wonder, are we all over that? We have those tools today. Do we use them? I think Eastland does a really good job of that. There's probably more that we could do. And the point here is Paul's showing us by his life that that's the kind of thing that gives us peace of mind. Sometimes we're under so much burden, we're under so much trials and tribulations that it's really easy to focus on ourselves. And I think Paul does this because when we focus on building relationships with others, it takes that focus off of ourselves and our woe is me kind of attitude and says, what can I do to help someone else? Completely changes the story for us, completely changes the dynamic. And that leads us to the final principle that Paul used to achieve a peace of mind. It's the most important principle I think that there is, and that is to trust God completely. Paul had a very deep trust in God that everything would turn out all right. He had the attitude that God has got this, and that really matters. 4 years ago, the Mayo Clinic published a book called A Guide to Stress-Free Living. There was a couple of chapters in this book that talk about finding life's higher purpose. The book says that we basically, if you want a stress-free life, you've got to find your higher purpose. You should probably do things like serving others, but really what you need to do is find yourself and find out what purpose resonates with you. And then, really live out that purpose in your life because it's meaningful for you and for who you are. But the author couldn't tell us what the purpose should be. They couldn't tell us really how to find it exactly. They couldn't tell you why it wasn't a good idea for your purpose to be a narcissistic jerk who walked all over people and used them for their own pleasure. They couldn't tell you what to do when you thought you found your purpose and you built your entire life around it and all of a sudden everything came tumbling down, whether it was financial problems or sickness in the family or betrayals in your life or whatever it was. The Mayo Clinic can't help you find that. But Paul found that, and he talks about it in Romans chapter 8. You see, Paul didn't need a book to tell him to go find a purpose that resonated with who he was. He understood that each of us have the same purpose, and that purpose is to love God, to serve God with all of our hearts. Romans 8:28 reads, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose." Paul didn't say good things work together for good. He didn't say all things were good. He said all things, good or bad, work together for good if what? If we are called according to God's purpose, not our purpose, not a purpose that resonates with us, with our purpose. We've already talked about a number of things in Paul's life that were not very good at all. But instead of finding his own purpose, he decided to serve God's purpose. And he tells us that we can have that same peace of mind if we are called according to God's purpose. Paul didn't have to conjure up some special walkabout, some special search for life's meaning. He knew already what life's meaning was because he met life's meaning on the road to Damascus. So even though a lot of things were broken in his life, even though a lot of things went wrong, a lot of unexpectedly bad and dangerous things happened to him, his entire life rotated around the core belief that God has got this. And when we can't make sense of why God is allowing us to suffer, when we can't make sense why God allows our loved ones to suffer, when we can't make sense why God is allowing so much evil to exist in this world, when it looks like our lives are falling into disarray and we are truly scared, don't forget, God sees it. He's taking care of it. He knows what we're going through. And so we need to have a deep trust in him. Because when we love God, all things will ultimately work together for good. God will handle anything that happens to us. Paul knew that, and we should know that too. So in conclusion, I want to wrap up by saying the Apostle Paul, his life started out great, and it fell apart pretty fast. But he didn't go find some special reason for living. He didn't go find himself and what mattered to him. He didn't go discover his own personal truth. He didn't spend time trying to reach a Zen meditative state. He wasn't living on the beach with his toes in the sand and an iced tea in his hand. He wasn't lazily swinging on a hammock watching the world go by. Instead, he put an end to bitterness. He did not let anything that anyone said or did to him before change who he was or change his focus on service to God. He made it right when he could make it right, and otherwise he let go. He didn't live in the past. He didn't dwell on the sins that he committed in his past persecuting the Lord's church. He didn't let it rob him of the grace and the mercy that God offers us all. He stopped living in the past and he moved forward. He pushed forward. He made plans to be of service. He didn't let his circumstances take him away from that either. He did what he could, where he could, with what he had. He was very flexible and did not take his eyes off of the prize.
And one of the ways he was able to do that is by building strong relationships with people he loved and who loved him and who were willing to care for him when he needed it. Someone that he could encourage when they were down and someone who could encourage him when he was down. And most important of all, he had a very deep foundational trust in God that God would take care of it all. And because of this, the Apostle Paul had the peace of mind and the peace of God that surpasses all understanding. And I think if we can live our lives by these 5 principles, we can have that peace too. So, if you haven't been baptized, that's the first step. You have to come forward. You have to confess that Jesus is the Son of God. You have to repent of your sins. You have to be buried with him in the watery grave of baptism. And then you can start that life. That life where you live by these principles that will give you a peace of mind. The gospel does not promise that our lives are going to be easy. They won't be easy. In fact, if you love God, the world will hate you because they hated him first. But the first step is to come and to admit that he is the Lord of your life. And if you've already done that and you've fallen away, we can help you with that too. You can make it known publicly that you're recommitting your life to him. He has told us if we approach his throne of grace with boldness and we confess our sins and we repent of them, that he will wipe them away as if they never existed. So I encourage you, if you are subject to the gospel call in any way, please come forward now as we stand and sing.